Hello friends, continuing with the last chapter epidemiology. Today we will see the various methods of epidemiological studies. They are also called types or they also can be called methods, isn't it? Now there are different methods and we know the definition of epidemiology that it is the branch which studies with the distribution of disease among the people, isn't it? Now different kinds of studies can be carried out, isn't it? Here there are different methods we will see first, isn't it? Now one is observational studies, isn't it? Then experimental studies, we will see the classification also, isn't it? There are three major epidemiological methods, isn't it? That is the descriptive studies, analytical studies, and experimental studies, isn't it? Now, before going in detail, I would like to tell you that in today's lecture, near about 5 descriptive questions we are going to cover. So, you refer textbook, isn't it? And listen the lecture carefully. We will see the classification, isn't it? This is the classification of epidemiological methods which are used to carry out the study, isn't it? Now, the two sections are there, that is the observational studies and experimental studies, isn't it? Observational studies are further bifurcated into descriptive studies and analytical studies, isn't it? This is the appropriate classification of methods we can tell, isn't it? And analytical methods further are subdivided into case control study and cohort study, isn't it? We will see the description also and you will understand in a better way, whereas the experimental we will discuss after discussing observational methods, isn't it? Now the under observational, as I said, we have two methods, that is the descriptive methods and analytical methods, isn't it? Now, descriptive epidemiological studies or descriptive method, isn't it? These are usually first phase of epidemiological investigation, isn't it? So, simple description we can say of health status of people or community, isn't it? That is descriptive. A description is recorded regarding the health status of the community, isn't it? Now, these are concerned with observing the distribution of disease or health related problem in human population and identifying the cause of disease, isn't it? So whatever the routinely available data is there, isn't it? Based on that, a description is prepared that comes under descriptive studies, isn't it? It is a first step in epidemiological investigation, isn't it? Now, simply we can take general questions, isn't it? When disease occurs, that is time distribution, where it is occurring, place distribution, who is getting disease, person distribution. So that comes under the descriptive studies, isn't it? Then next is analytical method, isn't it? Now, in this observational study, this is the second one, analytical studies, isn't it? So, as the word indicates, analyzing relationship between health status and other variables, isn't it? The objective is testing the hypothesis, isn't it? So, various tests can be carried out. Pathological examination will come under analytical method, isn't it? So, subject of interest is individual, but inference applied to population, isn't it? Now, This is second major type of epidemiological study, isn't it? Now here the individuals are taken from population and then the study is carried out on those individuals, isn't it, to find out the exact cause of the disease, isn't it? Now, to study this analytical studies, isn't it, in detail, this analytical study can be carried out in two different steps, isn't it? Like case control study and other is cohort study, isn't it? So simply meaning is also given in bracket, you can refer that case reference study and cohort study means follow up study, isn't it? Now the analytical studies are helpful to determine the statistical association, isn't it? Whatever the factor is there and disease is there, so they can be correlated, isn't it, by these analytical studies, isn't it? Then case control study are basically comparison studies, isn't it? It is first approach to testing causal hypothesis, isn't it? So tests also are carried out, and there are three features of these case control studies, isn't it? Both the exposure and outcome has occurred, isn't it? So cause, and then because of the cause, whatever the disease is there, that also occurs and that is found by this analytical study. Then now this study also involves backward from effect to cause, isn't it? Now this case control study, as I said, a sort of comparison studies are carried out, isn't it? And various tests are carried out. Now the second part of this analytical study is cohort study. Now this cohort is group of people with similar characteristics. So a group is selected where this whole group has common characters or common symptoms, isn't it? And this study is also called follow-up study, isn't it? Or incidence studies, isn't it? Now this can be carried out on a particular group also who are free from disease, isn't it? But some characters are similar, isn't it? And then this whole group is subjected, isn't it, to the exposure. So whatever the effect of exposure is there, that is studied, isn't it? So this cohort study usually it is carried out to obtain additional evidence to support the existence of association between suspected cause and disease, isn't it? So cohort study it is helpful to confirm, isn't it, the relation between the cause of the study, cause of the disease and the disease, isn't it? Both are interrelated, isn't it? So for that cohort studies are carried out, and there is a difference between cohort study and case control study also, isn't it? You must know the difference between case control study and cohort study, isn't it? Now case control study it is a common first approach to test causal hypothesis, isn't it? And cohort study it is just to obtain a evidence to find out the association between cause and disease, isn't it? And case control studies, they are carried out after exposure of a person, isn't it? So when the person is suffering from the disease. And cohort study can be carried out before appearance of the disease, isn't it? Then case control study can be carried out to find out the cause from the effects, and cohort study to determine disease frequency over a time period, isn't it? So that is the difference between case control study and cohort study, isn't it? Here we finish up the methods of epidemiology, isn't it? Then the next part in this epidemiology chapter is factors responsible for spread of disease or spread of communicable diseases, we can say. And this we have discussed many a times, isn't it? Three main factors are there: disease agent, host, that is the individual, and environment, isn't it? These are three main factors, and they are also called epidemiological triad, isn't it? Now disease agent, this is the first factor, isn't it? And these may be, we have seen classification of disease agents also in first chapter, concept of health, isn't it? So biological agents are there, isn't it? Like all microorganisms that we have studied, insects and all that, isn't it? Arthropods, that will come under biological agents. Then chemical agents, there are so many chemicals which are present inside the body, outside the body, isn't it? Like carbon monoxide, pesticides, fertilizers, isn't it? Then the fumes, dust, gases, all these come under the chemical agents. Then physical agents will include the excessive heat, excessive cold, X-ray radiations, electricity, any pressure applied. These are physical agents. Then nutritional agents, all the various kinds of nutrients that we take in the form of food, they also can act as a disease agent, isn't it? Like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. Then the social agents are also there. The social factors are also responsible for the occurrence of the disease, the spread of the disease, isn't it? So social factor is also very important, and in today's era we can discuss this social factor also, isn't it? Say for example, nowadays we are aware about the coronavirus, COVID-19, isn't it? So here, whatever the precautionary measures are given by the government, so in addition to sanitizer and mask, social distancing is also a very important factor to prevent this type of disease, isn't it? So this is about the first disease agent factor. The another important factor is host, individual, we subjects, isn't it? So we individuals act as a host, isn't it? And this host, when it is susceptible to microorganisms, or when the host is physically weak, isn't it? Then the microbes can attack, agent can attack, and it can cause disease, isn't it? So the immunity of the host is very important, isn't it? And here the many host related factors also play important role in spread of disease. So as they are given on your screen, like age, isn't it? Sex, that is male or female, hereditary, nutrition, occupation, customs and habits, immunity, isn't it? All these are important host related factors, marital status, socioeconomic status, isn't it? So certain diseases, if we take example of age, they are very common in childhood, like measles, it is more common, isn't it? Then in middle age, cancer is very common, isn't it? Diabetes is common. Then tuberculosis in old age, it is very common. Then if we take example of sex, so females, they are mostly suffering from the cancer of breast or uterus, isn't it? Then cardiovascular diseases are more common in males as compared to females, isn't it? Then hereditary factor is also very important. Here we can take example of diabetes, mental disorders, isn't it? Then nutritional disorders are also very important, isn't it? Certain habits, customs and habits also are responsible for the diseases, like for example smoking can cause cancer, isn't it? So this is another host factor which is important one, responsible for spread of disease. Third important factor is environment, isn't it? Now this environment is very important and it can uh, play the role in both the ways. If the environment is healthy, isn't it? If we take care of environment, then environment takes care of ourselves, isn't it? So healthy environment is favorable to host, isn't it? And if the environment is not healthy, if it is unhygienic, then it is favorable to disease agent, isn't it? And if environment is favorable to disease agent, it will cause disease, isn't it? Now the climate and season can determine whether it will be suitable to disease agent or host, isn't it? Because there are many diseases which are common in rainy season, for example malaria, isn't it? Then in winter season again the chances of typhoid are there, isn't it? Poor hygienic conditions also are responsible for spread of disease, isn't it? So biological environment is also very important, isn't it? So in this fashion, these three important factors collectively are called epidemiological triad, and question is asked on these three factors also. So here we can take example of spread of disease like typhoid fever, as I said, isn't it? So it is more common in young age, isn't it? The factors are given: low immunity, okay, then lack of personal hygiene, isn't it, is responsible for typhoid, isn't it? Then polluted water, open air defecation, all these things we have discussed in communicable diseases. The other example also we can take of cervical cancer, isn't it? So this is more common in old age, isn't it? The other factor responsible is multiple sex partner, isn't it? Lack of hygiene, smoking, isn't it? Then poverty, lack of health facility, they are also responsible causes. Now the next part in this chapter is the different modes of disease transmission. We can call modes of transmission or modes of spread, isn't it? Now these modes of spread of diseases, their classification is there and they are classified into two sections: the direct modes and indirect modes, isn't it? Direct mode will include direct contact, droplet infection, infected dust, isn't it? Animal bite, isn't it? Mucosa, soil, isn't it? Then vertical transmission we can call, or we can also call transplacental transmission, isn't it? This is the classification of disease modes of transmission. And the indirect modes, three main are there: due to vehicle borne, other is vector borne, isn't it, the arthropods, then fomite borne, isn't it, The airborne also we can also take into consideration, isn't it? Airborne, fingers. Now the direct modes of transmission, direct contact, isn't it? So some diseases they are spreading due to direct or close contact, isn't it? So when the person comes in close contact with the body, isn't it, or any part of the infected person, isn't it? So here we can take example of diarrhea, dysentery, sexually transmitted diseases, cholera, isn't it? So other is droplet infection, or we can also call direct projection also, droplet infection or direct projection. In some books it is given direct projection, isn't it? So the person coming in contact with the saliva drops, isn't it, while coughing, sneezing, spitting, talking and singing, isn't it? Common cold, or we can take example of any respiratory tract infection, isn't it? Then transplacental transmission or vertical transmission, that is from mother to fetus, isn't it? Okay. So we can take example of syphilis also, which is due to transplacental transmission, isn't it? Then indirect modes we will discuss, isn't it? The indirect modes that include are vector borne, vehicle borne and fomite borne, isn't it? Vehicle borne, isn't it? So the vehicles important, we mean water is a vehicle, milk, food, blood or blood products, isn't it? So transmission through inanimate objects, non-living objects, isn't it? So when we come in contact with the contaminated vehicle, isn't it? Waterborne diseases may be there, foodborne may be there, milk-borne may be there, isn't it? So if milk is contaminated, if milk is not properly boiled, isn't it? So milk is a good culture, isn't it? Medium for bacteria, and it easily gets infected. So the here we can take example of the serum hepatitis also, or that is the hepatitis B, isn't it? That is due to blood, isn't it? Then airborne, so transmission by dust or droplet nuclei, isn't it? Then vector borne, so vector, as we have discussed earlier, it can be any arthropod or living organism that transfers the infectious agent to the susceptible host. So any example of arthropod borne disease we can mention here, isn't it? Like it may be uh, malaria, isn't it? Plague or typhus fever may be there, isn't it? Then fomite borne. So due to fomites also, contaminated articles that are used by the patient, isn't it? So they can also act as a source of infection, that will come under fomite borne transmission, isn't it? So same that we have discussed, vector borne, isn't it? This may be various vectors, arthropods, as I gave you example, isn't it? Like mosquito, isn't it? Then other we can take example of the lice, isn't it? Flies. So various arthropods which are responsible for the spread of disease. Now the next part is how these diseases can be prevented and controlled, isn't it? So general methods of prevention and control of communicable diseases, isn't it? Now we have seen the three main factors: agent, host and environment. Also we have seen the various important modes which are responsible for spread of the diseases, like direct modes we have discussed and indirect modes we have discussed, isn't it? So keeping in mind the various modes which are responsible for spread of disease and the factors which spread diseases, the next part we will discuss is the general methods which can prevent and control spread of diseases, isn't it? Now this can be followed at three levels. One is controlling source of infection. As now on your slide it is given prevention of source of reservoir, isn't it? So either we can write down prevention of source of reservoir or controlling source of infection, it is one and the same. Other is blocking the modes of transmission. So interruption of disease transmission is nothing but blocking of modes of transmission. Whatever the different modes we have discussed, so they can be blocked. And third level is protecting the susceptible host, isn't it? So these are three steps at which the diseases can be controlled. First is the controlling the source of infection, prevention of source of reservoir, isn't it? Source or reservoir. So here early diagnosis is very important, isn't it? So very first step is to find out the disease, which disease is there, isn't it? If it is properly diagnosed, it can be easily treated, isn't it? And then it will not spread. So early diagnosis of the disease, early finding of the disease is very important. Other is notification. Now we have seen in communicable diseases that there are many diseases which are to be notified to the health authorities. Recently COVID-19, as it is many people are suffering, so their notification to health authorities is very important. So similarly in communicable diseases we have seen like leprosy, it must be notified, plague, it must be notified, isn't it? So many diseases are there which are highly communicable and they must be notified to health authorities who will take proper measures to control the disease. Then next is epidemiological investigation. So we have seen the various methods of epidemiological studies, isn't it? And accordingly then descriptive studies can be carried out. If need arise, analytical study can be carried out, isn't it? Regarding that disease. Then isolation of the patient is very important, isn't it? This is very important when the disease is communicable, isn't it? Why? Because to limit the spread of the disease to the general public, isolation is very important, isn't it? Now this period of isolation will vary depending upon the type of disease, isn't it? And this isolation can be done in hospital also or at home also. The patient can be isolated, it can be quarantined, isn't it? Then treatment. Now proper treatment after early diagnosis is very important, isn't it? So if the disease is diagnosed at a first stage, then whatever the treatment is there, that is properly given to the patient, and that will minimize the duration of disease and suffering of the patient, isn't it? So early treatment with antibiotics also is very important, isn't it? Then the next step in controlling these type of diseases is blocking modes of transmission, isn't it? Now how these modes can be blocked, how they can be interrupted, these direct modes, indirect modes. So here main we have to follow is strict hygienic measures, isn't it? Drinking water must be safe enough. All food items must be protected from disease agent. They must be stored properly. They must be covered. Human excreta should be disposed of in sanitary manner. Overall standard of living should be improved. Then arthropod control is very important, isn't it? Mosquitoes, flies and other insects. If there is a patient at home, so their discharges must be disposed of in sanitary manner. The fomites of the patient must be thoroughly disinfected, isn't it? So the hygienic measures are very important. They play very crucial role in blocking the modes of transmission. Then the third step is protecting the susceptible host, that is prevention of susceptible host. Now this host can be protected by active immunization and health education. Immunization is very important, isn't it? Vaccination is very important. Okay. Now recently you know that the vaccination drive is carried out in our country, isn't it, to protect the individuals from COVID-19 disease, isn't it? So many vaccines now are available, isn't it? And to prevent the disease in the susceptible host, isn't it? The individuals can be protected by vaccination or immunization, and the other is health education, isn't it? Now, immunization also we will speak in detail later on, isn't it? In this chapter only, isn't it? And there are so many vaccines that are available for various diseases, and most of the vaccines you know we have discussed in communicable diseases also. So, apart from vaccination, the other is health education, isn't it? Now, if health education regarding mode of spread and method of prevention is given to the general public, then with their active cooperation, most of the infections can be controlled easily, effectively, and within short period of time, isn't it? So health education also plays important role, isn't it? Specifically the general public who are not aware about the healthy ways of living, about the preventive measures, so this type of education can be given to them so that they can protect themselves as well as their family members also against so many diseases, isn't it? So this is all about the general methods of prevention and control of communicable diseases, isn't it? We have seen that these communicable diseases can be prevented and controlled at three levels, that is the controlling the source of infection, then blocking the mode of transmission, and protecting the susceptible host, isn't it? So here today we have covered near about 5 descriptive questions, isn't it? So first question was a descriptive question on the various epidemiological methods, isn't it? Then the other question we have covered on the important factors responsible for spread of disease like agent, host and environment. Then the common modes of spread, isn't it? Direct modes and indirect modes we have discussed. The question can be asked separately either on direct mode or indirect mode, isn't it? And then the various methods of preventing and controlling communicable diseases, isn't it? So, uh, while listening the lectures, refer textbook, refer notes, any textbook you can refer, isn't it? If you are not able to understand, listen twice or thrice, isn't it? So that you will understand this topic. Thank you.